Hey, this is Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to do something a little different. I've been experimenting a little bit with this channel, and I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite lessons learned from 2013. I'm filming this in September 2021, so I'm looking way back at an article I wrote in 2013. I stumbled upon this December 2013, looking at the top 10 things I learned about game design in 2013. And I'm going to look at this list and I'm going to compare it to what I have learned today because 8 years have passed almost since I wrote this article. Hopefully I've learned something along that way. But I did read over this article in advance, and there's a lot that I think will stay the same. Some of the context for this article I should mention is I will mainly mention or talk about Viticulture and Euphoria, because those are the two games that I had fully designed and released at that point. I was working on Tuscany, the big expansion to Viticulture at that point, but hadn't released it yet. So let's start with number 10. Actually, I have 10 and 10A. It looks like I have a little bit more. I must have pushed one in there at the end. 10A is to play a lot of different games. And I get excited about big, complicated, meaty games. So sometimes it's tough for me to get lighter games to the table. But I've learned so much from those games that make me think outside the box that I often keep myself in. Outside the box that I keep myself in. I see. It's weird reading how I used to write back 8 years ago. I think this is even more true today. I would say a couple things have changed about this. While I still get excited about big, complicated, meaty games, I would say the sweet spot for me now is like an hour-long Euro-style game, maybe a little bit longer. And there are many exceptions to that. There are many shorter games that I really love, many longer games that I really love. But I think the key spirit of this point is the same today, and that is I learn so much as a designer by playing a wide variety of games. Even though I am primarily a Euro game designer, a medium-weight Euro game designer. Euro, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, that means typically games with lots of agency, lots of control over the decisions you make and the outcome of those decisions. Even though that is primarily the space that I really enjoy designing in, that I learned so much by playing games outside that realm. And a recent example of this is I'm working on a game that I'm struggling with right now, really struggling with this game. And I played a game called Herbaceous over a little break with my parents. I introduced this very light set collection game called Herbaceous. And it was a great reminder to me in many different ways of how simpler can be better at times. That doesn't mean that it's right for my game, but it was a good signal to me at that time that some of the things that I was trying to make more complex, more complicated in this game that I'm currently designing didn't need that to be that way, weren't necessarily better because of the complexity and the complications I was trying to add. So, that was a game that was very different. I've also played heavier games in the games I've designed. So, anyway, this is a lesson that I definitely carry on to this day. Play lots of different types of games. The other number 10 game list, so I guess this is a top 11 list really, is to minimize frustration as often as possible. I have a long paragraph here. I'll post a link below if you want to read the article. I'll read a little bit of this. It says, it's all too easy to overlook frustration when you're testing the game with other players. For example, in Viticulture and many worker placement games, a big part of the game is the constraint that if other players choose an action, you may not be able to take that action. That's fine, and for a player who really enjoys the puzzle experience, they won't mind being blocked. But the problem in Viticulture is that the order of operations really matters for the winemaking process, so getting blocked a few times can ruin your plan. So we fixed that with a grande worker. Yeah, this was something, so you probably know Viticulture as the Essential Edition. Here's the Essential Edition of Viticulture. But there were two editions that existed before then, including the initial version of Viticulture, in which there was no grande worker. So the grande worker is a worker in Viticulture. It's a big guy. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here's an example of the grande worker. Each player gets one of these workers, and this worker can act as a normal worker if there's an action space available. You just put it on the action space like a regular worker. If that action space is not available, you can place the grande worker on the action and still take that action. It's a little change, but in a tight game like Viticulture, especially one with a lot of order of operations, it really, really helps at key moments of the game of having that out, having that option of, okay, I can still take this action even though me or other players have blocked the action spaces on that action. And so this was really, really nice. So I have this big constraint in Viticulture about these action spaces. This constraint is one of the more interesting elements of Viticulture, that you can't just place any worker anywhere. But the grinding worker gives you a little bit of freedom. And it adds a really interesting choice, especially since Viticulture is divided into summer and winter, or on the Tuscany board into all 4 seasons, as to exactly when do you use it. Because early on in the year, there might be an action that's filled up that you might want to use this grande worker on, but is it better for you to save it for later in the year instead? I guess the core spirit here, minimize frustration as often as possible. I don't know if I agree with this in spirit. I don't know if the example I gave was entirely indicative of what I was aiming for. But frustration is something that I always ask about when I've playtested a game, whether I'm playtesting locally or I'm running a blind playtest of one of our games. I always ask players, what was confusing, what was frustrating, what was not fun, what took you out of the fun? I'm trying to pay attention to that because I want to smooth out those frustration points. Doesn't mean that there can't be constraints. Doesn't mean a game can't be tight. But if a player is just purely frustrated by certain elements, then I try to identify that and eliminate it if possible. And sometimes I totally miss, like even fairly recently with Red Rising. One of the things I miss in Red Rising that we've, I hope, addressed with an official variant is that there can be a frustration in the game. There are a few cards that can banish cards from your hand, and it can be frustrating if you only have a few cards in your hand. Most players start out with 5 cards in your hand, and if you get one of those cards banished and you're down to 4, that can really limit your potential in the game. And so we've added this official variant in Red Rising that says that you cannot you cannot choose a player to banish or potentially banish a card from their hand if they only have the number of cards that they started the game with, which is usually 5. There's one house in the game that starts with 6 cards instead. And I think that has I really like that variant, and I know that I like it because it's a variant that I will always play with. And so that's the signal to me that I probably should have done something a little bit. I should have identified that frustration during the design process of Red Rising, and I missed it. I still miss it to this day, but I still agree with that sentiment from 2013. That's minimize frustration as often as possible. So here's the real number 9. The first game matters. So yeah, here's what I say back in 2013. I used to think that the first time any player plays a game, it's going to be clunky and long. The thing is, the first game matters. It has the potential, at least, of permanently impacting a player's experience with that game. It's like reading the first chapter of a book. If it makes no sense and it drags on forever, you may not finish it or even read chapter 2, even if chapter 2 is awesome. I think I agree with this sentiment even more, perhaps even much more than I did in 2013. I think the first game matters so much, especially with as many games are on your shelf, on your shelf of opportunity today. Look at your shelf of opportunity, see how many games are there. That first game can be the difference between you playing a game a dozen times or never playing a game again after that first session. So I design around this now. I always try to keep in mind that first game, the onboarding experience for that first game. And back in 2013, even though I had that feeling in mind, I don't think I did a very good job of it with Euphoria. I think Euphoria is a lot of fun. I'm heavily biased here as a designer of Euphoria. I think Euphoria is a lot of fun if you know how to play Euphoria. But the teaching of Euphoria, because there are so many interconnected systems on the board, I don't have the board handily available here, but it's in the box over here. But in Euphoria, for you to understand this system, you have to understand this system, and both of those are really only make sense if you also understand this system. That makes teaching a game really, really difficult because you're asking players before they can even start to take the simplest of turns, they have to understand a lot of complexity about the game. That isn't a great onboarding experience, in my opinion. Even though it can lead to great repeated plays, even though that level of complexity can lead to some really great repeated plays of the game. So I think even more than ever, the first game really, really matters. I think part of that is the complexity of the rules, how many interconnected systems you have, and part of it is how you design the onboarding process, how you offer players tutorials, learning guides. Like in Scythe, we have the quick start cards. In Wingspan, we have the swift start guide that helps you teach or learn a game. It kind of walks you through a few turns of the game, but still gives you interesting choices to make. And even just the idea that you can start taking turns within a few minutes of understanding the core ideas of the game, and then you can unravel those other deeper concepts of the game as you have taken a few more turns. And those early turns, even though they are important, even though they're invaluable, that they don't ruin your experience with the game if you have to go in a different direction after you understand some of those core concepts. That's something, the first game matters is something that I definitely keep in mind, even more so than I did in 2013. At number 8, I have the value of short-term goals. It's kind of interesting that I put this on the list because I don't know if I would highlight this as a major element of game design, but let's see what I say here. So I say something not so nice about Lords of Waterdeep, which has turned into one of my favorite worker placement games. Um, and I talk about how the more I played Lords of Waterdeep originally on my iPad, um, having quests and intrigue cards that led me in little directions early on in the game really helped me understand the game. I say giving players short-term goals to focus on while they develop their strategy is good for getting new gamers into a game and for giving experienced gamers concrete tasks to complete while the other half of their brains are working on their master plans. I actually really like the way I said that because I often think about the onboarding process. I don't always think quite as much about the player who's playing a game 10, 20, 30 times. But I think even in those games, those short-term goals really, really matter. Especially the way I said it here in that you might understand like Scythe. You might have a great understanding of how Scythe works. And every time you play, you have different combinations, different factors, different variables that are helping you try to figure out what that master plan is that you have in the game. But in the meantime, it is, I think, really helpful to have little short-term goals, little endorphin bursts, or little things to pursue. Whether it's using the bottom row action for the first time in Scythe, or whether it's going after an end of round goal in Wingspan, things like that, that give you these short-term goals to focus on while you're formulating and executing that long-term master plan. I've come to really, really appreciate this in game design. I don't know if I would necessarily put it on a top 10 list, but I do really like short-term goals. I like them in particular. Not just for learning games, but also coming back to a game after not playing it for a long time, just having something to focus on. The game gives me something to focus on that doesn't put in too much importance on that thing. So if I want to ignore it, I can, but just something to focus on as I'm trying to develop that strategy I find is really useful. So that's number 8, the value of short-term goals. And number 7, oh yeah, this is a big lesson I learned with Viticulture in particular, is balance your cards. And so in some of the early versions of Viticulture, I have all these visitor cards for Viticulture now. In some of the early versions of Viticulture, my thinking was, I'm going to give players lots of opportunities to get visitor cards, or any cards in the game, vine cards, wine order cards, summer or winter visitor cards. I'm going to give players an abundance of cards. And the choice that players will have is whether or not to use those cards and when to play those cards, which I think is a good thinking. I think that Viticulture feels very rewarding in that way. You're constantly getting more stuff, more free stuff, and you have to decide when to use that stuff. However, in some of the early designs of Viticulture, there were definitely visitor cards in particular that were only helpful early in the game, or they were only helpful late in the game. And one of the things I learned after that original edition of Viticulture was that in a game with a random draw, I really need visitor cards to be relevant throughout the game, because if this card is only good early on in the game and I draw it near the end of the game, it's going to feel like a wasted turn, a wasted blind draw. I think the other way you can avoid this a little bit by having like a visible card row, but with cards that have text on them, I don't like to ask players to have to read those cards from across the table. And so I don't like card rows or card rivers for cards like that. And even then, if you have a card river and it's clogged with cards that are no longer relevant later in the game, that doesn't work either. So I really like the sentiment of balancing your cards in the game so that they are useful and fun and functional early in the game, in the middle of the game, and late in the game, at any point in the game. Sometimes this can manifest in multi-use cards. So maybe a card has like a short-term bonus if you use it early in the game. Later in the game, that card might be more focused on endgame scoring, but it offers you both of those options. And that's kind of the strategy that I ended up taking with some of the later editions of Viticulture, in particular the Essential Edition. So that's balance your cards at number 7. At number 6, I have create a connection between mechanisms and theme. Here's the point I want to make. This is me back in 2013 again. If the theme matches the mechanisms, the game will be easier to learn and easier to remember. Thus, the more you connect mechanisms to the theme, the better. I definitely still agree with that to this day. When I design games, I might have an idea for a mechanism, or I might have an idea for a theme, but right away I'm trying to find themes to match that mechanism and mechanisms to match that theme. It all becomes part of the initial brainstorming process. And I have really found that statement to be true about if the theme informs the mechanisms and vice versa, then it makes the game easier to learn, easier to teach, and easier to remember. I'm sure you've had this happen when you've learned a game. If someone is teaching you a game and you're like, that mechanism doesn't make sense thematically, that can almost take you out of the experience. Whereas if the teacher can explain a mechanism thanks to the theme, like the breeding hut in Stone Age. Yes, if you really look at how that breeding hut works, it doesn't make all that much sense. You put 2 workers in that breeding hut, and a 3rd worker pops out and is ready to be placed the following round and needs to be fed right away. Yeah, it doesn't make entire thematic sense, but the abstracted idea of putting 2 workers in a hut and having a 3rd worker magically appear afterwards kind of makes thematic sense. You can explain that thematically, and I think that helps explain and remember rules. I'm going to do a video at some point, I think, of themes and mechanisms that mesh really well. It's just kind of hard to think of a top 10 format for that, or even a top 5 format for that, because there's so many games that do it well in micro levels. Like there's one little part of the game that is where the theme mechanisms match really, really well. But yeah, create a connection between themes and mechanisms. I definitely agree with that to this day. Number 5, blind playtesting is king. Yes, oh yes, I learned this quite a bit because with Viticulture, when I originally designed Viticulture, I did hardly any blind playtesting. I really did not understand the value of blind playtesting. I mean, I knew it was a thing, but I hadn't gone too deep into it. Blind playtesting is when you send the files for your game, typically digital files, to someone you don't know all that well, or don't know it at all, and they construct the game. They print it, they cut it, they put it together, and they learn it from the rules that you send them, and then they send you feedback. They send you some data, they send you some anecdotal feedback. At Stonemaier Games, we have a great group of ambassadors that do this. There are also, if you don't have random people around the world that you know who want to do that for you, there are playtesting groups that you can hire to do that. There's a link on our website for how to design a tabletop game, and there's some links there for blind playtesters that you can hire. But I didn't fully appreciate that back in 2012 with Viticulture, 2011 when I was designing Viticulture, 2012, and then even with Euphoria. I brought in a lot more blind playtesters then, but I didn't fully comprehend how important that was. But I found it to be so important for figuring out, for like smoothing out those frustrations that players can have for games, for finding the fun in game, finding the balance in games, and I guess to take it a step further in gathering all that data to really analyze that data. And I've done that in more recent years by working with a guy named Jeremy, a professional data analyst, who analyzes that data, particularly for our asymmetric games, to make sure they are as balanced as possible. That's been really, really helpful. I have learned about this. One element of this that I've learned over the years is that more blind playtest is not inherently better. Really, it's the value of how good those blind playtesters are at explaining what happened, and why it happened, and how they feel about it, rather than blind playtesters who skip all that stuff and just go and give you a solution. It's really your job, or my job as a designer, to figure out the solution. I want to hear what happened, why it happened in the playtester's eyes, and how it made them feel. I can use that information to find a good solution. Or I can at least try to find a good solution in that way. But and also the other side of this is also figuring out how to offer clear rule books. I've gotten better at writing rule books over the years, but the questions I get from blind playtesters always help me write better rule books and clarify the rule books. And because just writing them in a vacuum, there's so much that I would miss if I was not getting those questions. So yeah, blind playtesting is king. It is even more king than it ever was, especially finding quality blind playtesters who are willing to play a game multiple times. And we pay our blind playtesters. I think it is absolutely important and necessary to compensate your blind playtesters in some way. Maybe even give them a few options. Like I give blind playtesters an option between just some cash over PayPal or store credit. And I give them a little bit more for that store credit because probably eventually that money is coming back to Stonemaier Games in some way. But you can do that. You can offer them free games. I find it easier just to send a PayPal payment or a store credit. But I think they absolutely deserve compensation because it's work they're doing. And they're doing work on a timeline that you need them to do it on. Blind playtesting is king. And number 4, I guess this ties really well into number 5, is that writing rules is an art form. Some of the little tips I give here is Pay attention to rules that are difficult to explain, and then change the mechanisms so they're easier to explain. I think this is something that's often forgotten about rule writing. That uh, part of it is the actual writing of the rules themselves. But if you find yourself explaining one little mechanism for pages and pages in the rule book, that's a pretty good sign that you might want to change the game instead of just changing the rules and clarifying the rules. I always look for this in my game designs, and when I look at when I'm developing games by other designers, if there's a big wall of text, or even with examples about one specific element of the game, that's a signal that maybe we need to change that element of the game instead of changing the rules themselves. I also talk about using identifying exceptions to rules and using the word remember. So two of the things that I often think about when I'm writing rule books is if I have to use that word accept or exception, or if I have to use the word remember when I'm teaching a game or when I'm writing a rule book, that's a sign to me that that I really, well, I'd like to eliminate the exceptions. And for anything I'm asking players to remember, I should give them a visual cue in the game, whether it's a reference card, whether it's on their player mat, whether it's on the board, so they don't have to remember that. So I'm not expecting a player to remember something that's really important to the game. So it actually, this isn't just about rulebooks, this is about the user interface of the game itself. And I say also, third, the key to an effective rulebook is not just to be able to explain the game, but also to help players reference specific rules when they're playing the game. And yeah, that's a great tip. That I still think about that to this day. That part of the purpose of a rulebook is to learn the game. The other part is to reference it later when you're trying to find a specific rule. And rulebook, sometimes companies offer two different rulebooks, like a learning rulebook and then a reference rulebook. I think that's fine. I like to have it all in one place personally, because I'm kind of a visual learner. I can almost remember, like, after I read through a rulebook, I have a sense in my mind as to where I saw this rule at one point. And so if I have two separate rule books, then I don't have that sense of place or space anymore. But I do like having an index or glossary or something that I can refer to. And sometimes we've done like reference guides too. So we have the core rulebook and then a reference guide that repeats some of those core concepts in a more distilled fashion. The fourth part of this, I had a four-part tips here, is fourth, examples and illustrations go a long way, even in the earliest stages of the rules. Yes and yes. I still absolutely, I think visual examples are incredibly important for rulebooks. And I think that's even important in the early stages. Even when you have just a Microsoft Word or Google Doc version of the rulebook, having those visual examples or even just written examples can really, really help playtesters understand how to play the game. I don't think those are things that you just save for later when you're going to do the final layout of the final rulebook. I think those belong in the prototype version of the rulebook. So that's number 4, writing rules is an art form. Number 3, downtime is a killer, and the solution is engagement when it's not your turn. This is interesting. I don't know if so I totally agree with the idea that downtime is a killer. I don't necessarily think that the solution is engagement when it's not your turn. I think that is one solution. Like I love in Space Base, the game Space Base, that you are engaged even when it's not your turn. And the things that you're doing when it's not your turn don't get in the way of the player whose turn it is. You don't have to wait for other players. So I don't necessarily think that like simultaneous actions are the solution for this. But some form of engagement, some reason to pay attention when it's not your turn, I think is one solution for downtime. And downtime, by the way, if you're not familiar with that term, is when it's not your turn and you are waiting to take a turn or waiting to do something and you'd have nothing to do. So it's the time where you would instinctively pull out your phone. Hopefully not do that out of consideration for the other players at the table, but it's the time where you would pull out your phone because you have nothing else to do. I think the other, in fact, I do kind of mention this in the post, but and maybe I don't have it. No, I don't know if I mentioned it here, but the other big thing I think of reducing downtime is giving players opportunities to plan ahead for their next turn when it's not their turn. And so there are games that are directly opposed to this. Let's see, I don't know if I have any real examples here. Like in Viticulture. In Viticulture, you can, for the most part, plan what you're going to do next. You can say, okay, here's 1 or 2 actions that I'd like to take next. I'd like to do one of these 2 things next. However, in Viticulture, other players could take those actions and block those action spaces, and you can no longer do it. And so that prevents you from fully planning. However, that's where the grande worker, again, is the solution, because you've already planned to take those actions. You already have a plan in place. Things that other players are doing might interfere with that a little bit, but they're not completely impeding it. And the grande worker is your backup. So even if other players do those, block those actions, you can still go in with your grande worker. Euphoria is largely the same, because Euphoria, also a worker placement game, uses a bumping system where even if a player goes on an action that you were hoping to take, on many of those actions, you can still place your worker there, but it bumps their worker back to them. They get a free retrieve for that worker. And so basically these are systems that allow you to plan ahead for your turn when it's not your turn, and that can make downtime feel like it isn't there. Even though you're technically not doing anything when it's not your turn, even though you're technically not engaged, you can still have that opportunity to plan ahead. And I think that is a big way I think that games can address downtime. And there are some games, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are definitely games where the board state changes so much between your turn and the next turn that you really can't plan. You can't even have a plan and a backup plan. You really just have to wait for your turn, and then you take your turn. I try to avoid that. I try to avoid that in general. And number 2, forward momentum from the first turn is key. Yeah, I think about this as a progression these days. That's the word that I would use rather than forward momentum. And I actually talk about it in terms of viticulture here, how it can feel like in viticulture that you haven't made much progress a few years into the game, because oftentimes you won't have any victory points by that point, because viticulture is a lot about building up your vineyard and building up your grapes and your wine so that you can have big turns. And that can be very satisfying in viticulture. But early on in the game, there are very few ways to get points aside from visitor cards. And so giving players a feeling of forward momentum, I think, is important. But these days, I would definitely use that word progression instead. For me, progression is that you are better at doing things in the game on your second turn, your third turn, your 20th turn than you were a few turns before that. A lot of this comes down to engine building. The idea that you are building an engine, that the things that you're doing now are better than are mechanically better than the things that you were doing earlier in the game. Scythe is kind of the epitome of this. Wingspan is the epitome of this. That in Wingspan, when you take a turn late in the game, you have all these bird cards out. You're activating a ton of these bird cards. Even if you're not activating those cards, the place on your mat that you're activating, the core benefit is better than it was earlier in the game. And I think that is very satisfying. That you have this actual manifestation in the game, mechanical manifestation of how you are better now later in the game than early in the game. That sense of progression is really, really important to me as a designer. Yeah, I would say that's a huge part of what I think about when I design now. I love that sense of progression in games. So progression forward momentum is number 2 on this list. And last, it comes down to fun. I actually don't know if I would entirely agree with the sentiment. The phrasing I used back then is everything must be fun. And I think for me, fun is why I design games. I design games to be fun. The funness of a game is the heart of it. That's even more than the balance of the game. It's even more than the theme of the game, how intuitive the game is to play. All those things are very, very important. The theme, the mechanisms, all that. But in the end, I think it needs to be fun. And that is what I strive for in the game. So one of the classic examples I use in viticulture is that in one of the original prototypes of viticulture, your grapes didn't age, because that didn't make sense thematically, that you just have grapes sitting out on a crush pad for years and years, and somehow, and if you do that, and they're not aging, then they get in the way of your future harvest in viticulture. That's not correctly how to play the game. What I ended up doing is saying, okay, these grapes actually do get to age, just like your wine. So I created a parallel in the game. The wine and the grapes age from year to year. They get more valuable without you having to do anything. It's a passive benefit. It feels really good. And it doesn't get in the way of you harvesting more grapes off your fields in following years. And so I took a break from the theme to make something more fun. I think that is very much still true to this day. I think the difference that I would say about this here actually I have a Euphoria example as well. I say this is something I really learned during the design of Euphoria. At one point, the game evolved to the point that rolling dice became a nonchalant gesture that no one paid attention to. And actually, I have a story about that. I'll come back to it in a second. The dice might as well not have been dice. I realized, wait a minute, dice rolling should be fun. How is this not fun? How can it be more fun? That's when I came up with the idea of that rolling doubles could lead to double turns. We could take more than one turn. Sure, that meant I had to find ways to mitigate the luck factor involved, but right away the idea clicked. Yeah, I ended up even revising that a little bit more in the expansion, where if you want to take a double turn, you actually have to have morale. You have to spend a morale to take that second turn, which I think balanced it out even better. But it definitely made dice rolling more fun once the dice that you rolled mattered a little bit more than just the numbers on them. That rolling a double, there's always that possibility of rolling doubles and having a double turn. And that felt really, really good. And I want to back up even further than that, because in the original version of Euphoria, one of the prototypes for Euphoria, you didn't roll your dice at all. Dice were simply used as a counter to show how intelligent your workers were, how much they knew that they were operating in a dystopia. And I have the Euphoria dice here. I can actually show those. So here's the Euphoria dice. Thematically, that was neat, but I find that one of the best things about having dice in the game is the moment when you actually get to roll them. And if you take that out of the game, you're removing one of the most fun elements of dice. Okay, I'll finally get to the point of that I was trying to get to, which is that I don't think everything has to be fun. I think fun is a major focus of mine. Fun is a major tenet of mine when I think about designing games. But there are other emotions and other experiences that sometimes I want to evoke in players. For example, there's a game I'm designing right now where I want players to have fun, absolutely. But I also want them to feel tension. I want them to feel fear, maybe a sense of dread, a sense of uncertainty and venturing into the unknown. Those are other feelings that I'm trying to evoke in players. And in the moment, those feelings might not be entirely fun. Hopefully they will lead to fun, memorable moments. But there are other feelings I'm trying to evoke beyond just the feeling of having fun. And so I would say now that the fun is really important, but the overall experience that you're aiming for is key. Because you might have a game where you want players to feel fear. You might want to have a game where players feel a sense of togetherness with one another. In cooperative games, oftentimes you want to have that feeling of working together. And hopefully it is fun, but that might not be the primary emotion you're going for. And so that would be my revision to this number one rule, that everything must be fun. That's my revision to it. This is speaking of fun. This has been fun to look back on how I was designing games like Viticulture and Euphoria back in 2012, 2011, 2013, and how I design games today. A lot of these still resonate with me, but as you can see, I have evolved a little bit as a designer in terms of the things that I tend to look for as I am designing and playtesting and developing games, whether I'm the designer or just the developer and the publisher. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which of these resonate with you? If you think of any great examples for these, and what are some of the core things that you think about for design? Whether you're a designer or a player of games, if there are certain elements in those games that you look for that really stand out, and maybe actually more critically, this might be easier to pinpoint. How have you evolved as a gamer and a designer in terms of your preferences now compared to 8 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. Thanks.